The galaxy did not end with a whimper, but with the sound of a human heartbeat, amplified across 1 billion subspace frequencies, a terrifying, rhythmic thud that turned the blood of the High Council to absolute ice. I watched it happen from the central observation dais of the galactic citadel, my primary optical receptors twitching as the real-time telemetry from the Third Corps fleet flooded our monitors. The Vulcan Empire had just dropped 3,000 dreadnoughts directly into the Sol system, their superweapons primed to incinerate the cradle of the newest, softest species to ever sit at our table. The grand ambassadors around me were sipping their crystalline nectar, chuckling softly at the impending slaughter of a race that had only just discovered hyperspatial folding a mere half-century ago. They thought it was the execution. They had no idea they had just walked into a slaughterhouse, where they were the livestock. The Vulcan High Command estimates total pacification of Earth within 3 solar hours, Ambassador Xylar remarked, his reptilian scales glistening under the artificial starlight of the council chamber. He gestured dismissively toward the main holoscreen, where the tiny blue marble of Earth looked utterly defenseless against the encroaching wall of Vulcan obsidian. Warplates. The humans are a fragile, emotional species. They spend more time building museums and writing poetry than refining plasma weaponry. Their fleets are small, their hulls are thin, and their technology is practically archaic. They are an evolutionary dead end trying to play at galactic politics. This will be a swift, necessary lesson for the rest of the fringe worlds. I leaned forward, my multi-jointed fingers gripping the edge of my terminal as the Vulcan flagship, the World Breaker, broadcasted its final ultimatum to the human homeworld. The alien commander's voice boomed through our chamber, filled with the arrogant certainty of a predator facing a newborn cub. Humans of Earth, the Vulcan warlord bellowed. Your brief moment in the stars is at an end. Yield your world, dismantle your meager orbital platforms, and accept your place as indentured servants of the Empire, or we will turn your atmosphere into a raging sea of fire. You have 60 seconds to comply. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable transmission of surrender. I expected panic. I expected the frantic, weeping pleas of a doomed species, begging the Galactic Council for an intervention that would never come. Instead, the holoscreen flickered and the face of an elderly human male appeared. He wore a crisp, dark blue uniform adorned with a modest arrangement of metallic ribbons. His hair was stark white, his face etched with deep lines of age, but his eyes, God's, his eyes were like 2 shards of polished flint, utterly devoid of fear. He didn't look at the Vulcan warlord. He looked directly through the subspace relay, staring straight into the Galactic Council chamber, straight into us. We gave you 50 years, Admiral Marcus Vance said, his voice shockingly calm, carrying a low, gravelly resonance that vibrated through the floorboards of the Citadel. We gave you 50 years to show us that the universe was wide, fair, and just. You chose fire. Remember that. The screen went black. Xylar laughed, a harsh, dry sound. Arrogant primates. To the very end, they rely on empty theatrics. Commander, open fire! Erase them from the stellar charts. But as the Vulcan fleet moved to execute the order, something strange happened on my telemetry boards. The local space around Earth didn't show signs of mass evacuation or panicked defensive maneuvers. Instead, thousands of deep space anomalies began registering across the entire Sol system. They weren't incoming ships. They were signatures originating from inside the planets themselves. My mind reeled, plunging backward through the classified archives I had spent decades monitoring. Suddenly, a series of long-forgotten, deeply buried surveillance logs from the past 50 years flashed through my memory. We had assumed the humans were slow builders. We had watched them tunnel deep into the crust of Mars, into the frozen ice of Europa, into the very tectonic plates of Earth itself. Our scouts had reported it as primitive resource mining, the desperate scrambling of a young species trying to feed its exploding population. We were so blind. 32 years prior, deep within the subterranean caverns of the Olympus Mons on Mars, a young human engineer, her face covered in grease and sweat, wiped her brow as she looked up at a massive, skeletal structure of dark iron and coiled superconductors, stretching miles into the Martian mantle. "Are we sure about the dampeners, sir?" she asked an older officer standing beside her. "If the Council picks up the gravitational leak, they'll know we're building planetary-scale mass drivers. The officer took a drag from a paper cylinder, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. The council only looks at what we show them, kid. They think we're a race of farmers and poets. Let them keep looking at the sky. We build the anvil in the dark. 15 years prior, in the hollowed-out core of an asteroid in the Kuiper Belt, automated assembly lines operating in complete electromagnetic silence welded hyper-dense carbon nanotube armor plates onto ships that had no windows, no luxury quarters, and no purpose other than absolute devastation. A lone human commander stood in the observation pod, looking at a fleet of 10,000 unlisted dreadnoughts hidden behind simulated dust clouds. When the day comes, the commander whispered to the empty room, they will realize that peace wasn't our weakness. It was our mercy. Back in the present, the council chamber grew suddenly, quiet as the telemetry data began to defy all known laws of orbital logistics. What is happening? Xylar demanded, his laughter dying in his throat. Why are the human orbital stations moving? They aren't stations, I whispered, my voice trembling as the truth slammed into me with the force of a supernova. They aren't stations, Ambassador. They're barrels. Before anyone could speak, the crust of the moon Luna literally split open. Massive, tectonic-sized blast doors slid back, revealing a weapon system so colossal it defied galactic engineering standards. The humans hadn't built a defensive fleet. They had turned their entire lunar satellite into a magnetic railgun capable of accelerating continental-sized slugs to near light speed. At the same instant, the oceans of Earth churned as thousands of hidden oceanic silos opened, launching massive, atmospheric-breaching missiles that didn't rely on plasma or antimatter, but on the pure, brutal kinetic force of solid tungsten. Target the flagship. Admiral Vance's voice echoed once more, overriding the Council's secure encryption channels. Let them know that Earth does not break. We break empires. The first volley from Luna was invisible to the naked eye, a relativistic kinetic slug that traversed the distance between the moon and the Vulcan vanguard in a fraction of a second. The Vulcan dreadnought Agonizer, a 3-kilometer-long beast of war protected by triple-layered particle shields, simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no spectacular burst of light. The kinetic energy was so immense that the ship violently atomized, its atomized hull plating turning into a secondary shrapnel cloud that shredded 2 adjacent destroyers. Impossible. Xylar shrieked, slamming his fists onto his console. Their shields should have deflected plasma. What kind of savages throw raw iron through space? The kind that no shields are designed to disperse energy. Not solid mass moving at 0.9 C, I yelled back, my panic completely shattering the decorum of the High Council. The human counterattack was not a calculated naval engagement. It was an absolute, unrestrained eruption of primal violence. From the shadow of Saturn, from the hollowed-out valleys of Mars, and from the deep trenches of Earth's oceans, thousands of dark, angular warships surged forward. They didn't possess the elegant, aerodynamic curves of the Vulcan ships or the shimmering, multicolored shields of the Council races. They were brutal, blocky rectangles of black steel, covered in point defense turrets and heavy missile pods. They moved with a terrifying, reckless speed, completely ignoring defensive formations to dive straight into the heart of the Vulcan lines. The Vulcans fired back, their heavy plasma lances cutting through the human vanguard, melting armor plates and venting atmosphere into the void. I watched in horror as a human cruiser took a direct hit to its midsection, snapping the ship completely in half. By all galactic military doctrine, the crew should have surrendered, or the life pods should have launched. Instead, the 2 severed halves of the human ship ignited their auxiliary thrusters. Both sections, spewing fire and dying men, accelerated faster, turning themselves into manned kamikaze rams. The forward section slammed directly into the bridge of a Vulcan carrier, while the aft section detonated its remaining reactor, core inside the hangar bay of another. They aren't retreating, an aide gasped, staring at the rapidly dropping Vulcan life signs. Even when their ships are destroyed, they just keep coming. They are fighting with their bare hands. In the center of the chaotic melee, the human flagship, the USS Enterprise, engaged the Vulcan flagship, the World Breaker. The Vulcan vessel was vastly superior in size and firepower, its heavy disruptors tearing away chunks of the Enterprise's forward hull. The bridge of the human ship was entirely exposed to the vacuum, sealed only by emergency force fields. The subspace video feed from the Enterprise briefly filled our screens. Admiral Vance was bleeding from a deep gash above his eye. The air around him was thick with toxic smoke and the smell of ozone. Beside him, a young communications officer was weeping, not out of fear but out of agonizing grief as she held the lifeless hand of a technician slumped over a shattered console. Vance knelt beside her for a fraction of a second, placing a bloody hand on her shoulder. His voice was no longer that of a cold military commander, but a father comforting a child in the dark. "Hold the line, son," he murmured softly to the dying technician, before standing back up and facing the main viewport with a face of absolute fury. "We owe them a debt for every drop of blood they spilled on our soil today. Collect it with interest." That moment, that single heartbreakingly fragile display of human empathy amidst the absolute carnage of war, shook me to my very core. They weren't unfeeling monsters or biological weapons. They were terrifyingly gentle, fiercely loving creatures who simply possessed a terrifying capacity to endure hell for the sake of those they loved. The twist came when the Vulcan warlord, realizing his fleet was being systematically dismantled by an inferior species, attempted to engage his hyperdrives to escape back into the safety of Council space. "Activate the gravity wells," the Vulcan commander ordered. "We must retreat and regroup." "Negative, flagship," the tech officer responded, his voice cracking with pure terror. "We can't engage the drives. Space is locking down." On the holoscreen, a massive, ancient human vessel, looking more like an industrial oil rig than a warship, drifted into the center of the system. It didn't have guns. It didn't have missiles, but as its central core spun up, a blinding, golden pulse of energy erupted across the entire Sol system. It wasn't a weapon. It was a localized spatial anchor. It didn't just prevent hyperspatial folding. It entirely rewrote the local physics of the system, dragging every single ship down into the raw, unrefined reality of Einsteinian space. The humans hadn't just defended their home. They had locked the doors from the inside. They had trapped the apex predators of the galaxy in a room with them, and they had thrown away the key. "You don't understand," I said, turning to the stunned, silent members of the Galactic Council, my voice filled with a chilling awe. "They didn't hide their fleet because they were afraid of us. They hid it because they wanted to make sure that when we finally showed our true faces, none of us could ever run away." The climax was an absolute beautiful symphony of destruction. The USS Enterprise, its hull blackened, its shields entirely gone, drove itself directly into the underbelly of the world breaker. The human ship fired every single one of its point defense cannons at point-blank range, melting through the Vulcan flagship's shield generators from the inside out. At the same time, Admiral Vance ordered the final, absolute detonation of the lunar railgun. The massive lunar weapon fired a hyperdense slug of pure collapsed matter directly through the center of the Vulcan fleet formation. The shockwave of displaced space-time was so violent it literally ripped the remaining Vulcan dreadnoughts apart, their hulls twisting and buckling under the artificial gravity shear. The world breaker began to break apart, its structural integrity collapsing as explosions tore through its primary reactors. The Vulcan warlord looked out his crumbling view screen, watching the burning, scarred, but utterly victorious human flagship backing away from the wreckage. What are you?" the Vulcan commander gasped over the dying comms channel. Admiral Vance stood tall on his shattered bridge, the smoke clearing around him, revealing the blazing light of the Sol sun rising behind the blue earth. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes burning with the unyielding, immortal spirit of a species that had survived ice ages, nuclear dawns, and the cold indifference of the cosmos. "We are the species that conquered our own demons," Vance shouted, his voice echoing like thunder across the galaxy. "Did you really think we would let a handful of aliens take our paradise? We are humanity, and this is our sky." The Vulcan flagship exploded into a brilliant, blinding star, illuminating the Sol system and casting long, golden shadows across the pristine hulls of the victorious human fleet. In the Galactic Council chamber, there was an absolute suffocating silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The crystalline nectar glasses slipped from the limp fingers of the ambassadors, shattering on the polished floorboards. Ambassador Xylar sat frozen, his face completely pale, his scales trembling as he looked at the telemetry screen. The 3,000 dreadnoughts of the invincible Vulcan Empire were gone, reduced to floating debris and expanding clouds of glittering stardust. The human fleet, though battered and scarred, was already reforming into tight, disciplined battle groups. They weren't repairing their ships. They weren't celebrating. They were turning their prows outward, pointing their massive, flat kinetic barrels away from Earth and directly toward the jump points leading back to the Galactic Citadel. I looked at the screen, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear. I felt a wild, untamed electric thrill racing through my veins. I looked at the snobbish, tyrannical politicians who had ruled the galaxy through fear and intimidation for millennia, and I realized their reign was officially over. A new era had just dawned, forged in the fires of human defiance and absolute willpower. I stood up from my terminal, threw my hands into the air, and let out a roaring, deafening cheer that echoed off the high walls of the silent chamber, cementing the terrifying, magnificent truth that would forever change the stars.